If I had known everything that would happen from the moment the Lord called me on the shores of the lake all those years ago, I'm not sure I could have followed. Had I known all the joys and the pains and the trials and the agony that we would go through together, I think I would have stayed in the boat. I've always been a determined man, stubborn. Determined, yes, to be sure, but stubborn. I like challenges. I like the idea that there can be a task I can do if I just set my mind to it, if I'm just determined and focused enough, I can do it. Fishing, I suppose, is a bit like this. You have to be patient, so patient. You can go all day and all night without catching anything, but sometimes you just have to forego a night of sleep and just be ready for that moment when the school of fish swims into your net. You have to be ready at that moment to pull them up. For so long I had thought being a disciple was like this. If I just tried a little bit harder to be a faithful disciple, if I just did one more deed of bravery, of determination to try and show the Lord how dedicated I was, just how much I loved him, then that would be enough. But if I had known the ways in which being a disciple would wound me, would illuminate my weakness, would show me determination for all its worth was not enough, I'm not so sure I could have gotten out of the boat and followed. And I don't think it was until that night, that final night in the garden, where I really began to understand. I will never, ever forget that night. The night I heard my Lord pray. I remember everything about that night. The breeze rustling the trees, the crickets chirping, how heavy all our hearts were at this moment. The Lord had told us something that had left us stunned. He had said that one of us who had followed him all this time, one of his own whom he had called from the very beginning, one of us would betray him. I think a few of us were trying to imagine who it might be as we exchanged glances of suspicion looking from side to side. A few of us began to doubt ourselves. Was it something I said? Was it something I've done? A few of us refused to believe it was true. Surely we'd misunderstood. Perhaps it was another parable or something like that. Another one of those things that we just seem to have misunderstood. But make no mistake, our hearts were heavy as we came into this beautiful garden at the foot of that sacred mountain. We were all exhausted. We were worn out. Physically, yes. All the threats that were being made against us, we knew how dangerous our situation was. We had been on the road for weeks, perhaps months. And ever since we returned to the city, to Jerusalem, I don't think any of us dared to shut our eyes for too long, wondering if the authorities might come and seize us in our sleep at any moment. We were exhausted, but also emotionally. This constant mix of highs and lows. We had seen the eyes of a blind man opened. We had seen thousands fed with just a few loaves and fish. We had seen a man who could have financially supported us for the rest of our days, turned away by the Lord. I thought we were finally beginning to understand that it was the poor, these people that we felt so uncomfortable around. These were the people that the Lord really liked to be around. We were only just starting to get the hint that this was the case. And women. I've never been completely comfortable around women, to be honest. They've always seemed to me to be so unpredictable in the things that they would do. Like that woman who trailed Jesus like she were his shadow, just trying to touch his cloak, thinking that would heal her. I suppose it did. Or just a few days beforehand, that woman who had poured an expensive bottle of perfume all over Jesus' head. We thought that discipleship, being a disciple, was all about learning to care for the poor. And so we were outraged. Could not this bottle of perfume be used to provide sustenance for the poor? But the Lord silenced us with a look. "Let her alone," he said. Again, we did not understand, though clearly she did. Do you know what it's like to be told time and time again that you don't understand, that you've missed the point? And now this last straw, that one of us would betray him, the one whom we had followed all this time. Yes, our hearts were oh so heavy as we came into the garden that night. The Lord asked us to stop. He gathered us, his brothers, to him again and said, "You will all be deserters. Tonight you will all fall away." We refused to believe it. We protested. We insisted that would not be the case. Surely not us. At least that was what we told ourselves. But I had had enough. I was determined. I was dedicated. "No, Lord," I shouted, like I was calling out to someone 100 meters away, when the Lord and my brothers were as close to me as you are to me now. "No, Lord, all the others may fall away, they may desert you, but I will not, I will not." Oh, how I shouted at that moment. The Lord sighed. He looked at me. You could feel his gaze. It was like something that you could touch. This gaze that contains so much love and compassion and sadness mixed in with it. When he looked at you, it was like a blanket was being wrapped around you, while at the same time, this wave of tears was being washed over you. It was like I could feel his love for me and his sadness at that moment. "Truly I tell you," he said, "before this night is over, you will deny me 3 times. It could not be true. It could not be true. "Even if I have to die with you," I said, "I will not deny you." The Lord sighed. His sigh was like his gaze. There was so much in that sigh. He didn't seek to deny all our protestations of loyalty and dedication. Perhaps it seemed that the strain of what he knew he was about to go through was finally getting to him. Or perhaps he just wanted to spend his last few hours with us in peace. We went on a little further, a little deeper into the garden. Then he asked us all to wait. All except me, and James and John. He took us with him a little further. And then he asked us to stay, to keep watch while he prayed, to stay awake. We were fighting back sleep. As I said, we were exhausted, both physically and mentally, at this moment. Even as I could feel my head nodding, drooping, I could make out the faint outline of my Lord as he walked a little further, not quite out of earshot. You could see the grief in his face at this moment, those lines of care etched in to his expression. But I was not prepared to see what I then saw at this moment. He cast himself on the ground, like there was something at that moment, some element, some bond of resolve, of strength in him that had finally snapped, something that finally gave way. He cast himself on the ground, prostrate. Father, that word he loved to speak, Father. When you heard him say this, you would have felt embarrassed or ashamed like I did. Father. He said that word with such intimacy that when you heard him say that, you felt like you were intruding on something so private, so personal. Such was the intimacy with which he said this name, Father. All things are possible to you. Take this cup from me. Even in my sleep-deprived state, I was amazed and filled with doubt. The Lord that I had followed all this time, who I thought was so strong, so determined, so focused, so unwavering in his dedication to his mission, was all this time weak and broken. That there was something in him that seemed at that moment so utterly overthrown, so utterly broken. And then I heard him speak again. Not my will, but your will. Perhaps he had straightened up, perhaps he had regained his resolve. Perhaps he had regained his composure and his determination at that moment. I chanced to look up. It was not so. He remained prostrate on the ground. He was no less broken at that moment as he uttered those words, your will be done, not my will, but your will. The Lord that I had loved and admired for his strength all this time was not whom I thought he was. Overwhelmed with confusion, bewilderment, and exhaustion, I finally collapsed into sleep. And when I came to, the Lord was standing over me. Simon, he said, Simon, do you know what it's like to hear the Lord call you by name? Simon, he said. There was no anger in that voice, even though it certainly wouldn't have been out of place, I suppose. There was perhaps a bit of exasperation, but overwhelming compassion as he called me by name, Simon. Your spirit is so willing, but your flesh is weak. Even exhausted as I was indignant. I had no words to put into expression at that moment how I felt. I am not weak, I wanted to protest. I am not weak, never. I am many things, proud, stubborn, but not weak, not weak. But I suppose he was right. Staying awake was not my forte. I fell asleep again and again. In moments afterwards, I tried to defy what my Lord had told me. I tried, as I had always done, to try and come up with some final act, some action of determination and bravery that would demonstrate how strong I was. There was my moment of swordplay in the garden when the priests and their soldiers came to arrest my Lord. And then as they led him away, I tried to follow him as close as I dared. And I was put to shame. As my Lord had told me, I denied him 3 times. I will never forget that night. The Greeks, they have this saying that wisdom comes late. The owl of the goddess of wisdom, they say it only takes flight at dusk. In this, I suppose they're right. It's only after all these years that I think I've begun to understand something that I had missed all this time beforehand. All this time I had thought that being a disciple was about having an iron will, dedicating myself so completely, being so determined to follow my Lord and my Saviour. But when the Lord prayed that night, it was not the voice of one who has an iron will, but the voice of one whose will was completely submerged into that of the Father. Not my will, but your will, he prayed. His voice was not the voice of strength, of dogged determination, but one of brokenness. A voice that was so completely and utterly given over to the will of the Father. It was not that he was so brave and so determined all this time, but whatever bravery and determination he did have, it came from his brokenness, his willingness, his openness to depend completely and utterly upon the one who is the creator and the sustainer of all things. If you could have heard him pray that night, you would have heard as if in all creation was listening in as he spoke those words, Father, all things are possible for you. It was as if the wind had ceased to rustle in the trees. Even the crickets stopped chirping. It was as if all the world was listening in to his prayer. Such was the intimacy of his relationship with the Father that when you looked at his face, you knew that you were seeing into the eyes of the one who had created and sustained all things, who was there from the very beginning. It was through this moment, I think, that at long last I've learned to depend on someone who is not me. In our community now, where we share our resources together in defiance of the world around us that tries to tell us that we are all individuals and separate and divided, we learn to depend upon each other. We learn to look into the faces of each other and see the one who is broken for our sake. It's in their faces, not in the determination of our own wills, that we learn to be disciples. We make a special effort in this new community to welcome the poor, those who don't have very much. And to be sure, we want to provide for them, but they provide for us. They know what brokenness means. When we look into their faces, we are reminded of the one who was broken for our sake. We learn all the more through them amongst us to depend on people who are not me. I said that had I known what was ahead, when the Lord called me on the shores of the lake all those years ago, had I known what lay ahead, I don't think I could have followed. I would have stayed in the boat. And yet here I am, a disciple of sorts, I suppose. But not because of anything I've done, not because of how determined I might be, not because of anything I am, but because of who God is, because of who my Lord was and is and will be, and because we are these sisters and brothers in whose faces, in whose very faces, I am reminded of the Lord whom I loved and followed, whose life was broken, the truly human one, who did not shy away, who did not disguise his frailty, but was so completely open and vulnerable to the will of the one who sent him. It was only through this experience, that moment, that evening in the garden, that I think I finally learned what discipleship really means. It was finally in that evening that I could learn to pray, not my will, but your will be done. Amen.